Hi, I'm Blake Scarlevi with Route 16, and in this video, I'm doing a quick pro tip about Power Automate, specifically around parallel operations. So if you don't come from a development background, you might not be aware, but there's a ways to run logic like all at the same exact time in a parallel manner instead of a single instance, and this can help exponentially increase the performance of your code. And so the same idea is carried into Power Automate as well in a couple of different ways. And I have a sample flow here that I could show you. So the first way is just by branching your logic. So you can see these two branches in parallel. The way to do that is when you go to add an action, you can actually add a parallel branch and it'll branch it out like this. So as you can see up here, we just have a single line trigger. Then I'm going to set an array. Then I'm setting a variable. It's waiting for the previous action to finish before moving on. Well, if these things aren't dependent on each other, you could run them in parallel at the same exact time, and that can help speed up your flow, right? So that's one way to do it. A lot of times, like if you're I see a lot of flows where specifically around Dataverse where maybe I'm doing some queries first to get some data. Well, if those queries aren't dependent on each other, you can run them in parallel and save some time versus waiting for one query to finish, then doing another query, then doing another query, so on. Now, if they're dependent, then that's trickier. You know, have to run them single threaded. But if they're not, you can run them at the same time. If they're long running queries, that could save you a bunch of time. So the next way to do it, which is what this video is more showing off, is with loops. So when we do like an apply to each, by default, it's going to run each loop instance single threaded back to back. So it's going to wait for the first loop to finish, go to the next one, go to the next one, and so on. But through the settings, you can actually make it parallel. So each loop instance is going to run at the exact same time, and that could save you a ton of time. And the main limitation is a lot of times you might want to use a variable or reference a variable with inside that loop. Well, within the loop, if you're setting a variable and it's in parallel, it's the same instance of that variable. So each loop thread is like overwriting that variable on top of each other. And so it can just be all messed up. So that's a lot of times the big limitation with trying to do parallel loops. Well, my colleague JR just actually told me about this pro tip not too long ago, where instead of using variables, which can be messed up in a parallel loop, we can leverage composes instead, and it'll be exactly how we want it. And that's what I'm going to show off here. So I never knew this, so shout out to JR. It's a great tip. But what I'm doing here in this flow, I'm just using a compose to make an array. So I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then I'm initializing a count variable. It's just an integer. And then my loop on the left, and this is how you enable parallel. So you just go to settings. By default, this concurrency is off. You just flip it on. And then you can pick the degrees. So essentially how many are running at the same exact time. So this is all dependent on what you're doing. So you got to keep in mind like API limits, bogging down like the server that you're accessing. So if you're hitting Dataverse or a third-party system and you're trying to, because you can go up to 50. So if you set it to 50 and you're hitting some server, like it's going to be hitting it, 50 times all at once if you have a loop with 50 or more, right? So just some things to think about. This one setting you can kind of play around with. By default, it's 20, which is pretty good. But like Dataverse, for example, you could be hitting API limits if I'm doing a bunch of Dataverse calls in these loops and they're all running at the same time. that's going to be a lot of calls all at once. I might be hitting some limits. So it's just one thing to think about based on what you're doing. Um, but right now I'm just going to go with the default, so 20. Um, and both of these loops are in parallel with 20. So they're the same. So what I'm first going to do on this one on the left, I'm going to set my count variable to the loop number. So essentially it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then I'm using a compose to just output the value of this variable that I set. So you would think if I set this variable to 1, it's going to output a 1. If I set it to 2, it's going to output a 2, etc. And then on the right, instead of using a variable, I'm using a compose, and I'm setting the compose to my loop number. And then I'm very similar. I'm outputting the output of this compose. So instead of outputting the variable, I'm outputting this compose here. And then as a bonus, we're going to see what this output loop number here, we're going to see what it looks like at the end of when all the loops are done. So to save some time, I ran this already, so let's take a look. So here on the left, loop number 1, we set our variable to 1 to be expected, right? Our first loop, even though there's 5 running at the same time. So in theory, it could be anything, but it's setting it to 1, and then we're going to output the value of that variable, which is 2. So what's happening is like 5 of these actions of setting the variable are happening almost at the same exact time, right? So what's happening is like this is getting set it to 1, but the second instance is setting it to 2. And so by the time it comes to output, it's outputting the 2 because the 2 set it as well. So not what we would expect, and one of the limitations for parallel loops, because it messes with variables, right? So if I go to 2, I'm setting the variable to 2, outputting to 2, and then 3, setting it to 3. It's still outputting to 2. It's presumably that's like the last one. It's set. Then 4, output to 2. 5, output to 2. So it's just all messed up, right? So it's hard to use a variable because if I want to reference this in my loops, it's just going to be something random. I can't guarantee what the value is going to be. Now, if we go to the right, where we're not using a variable, we're using a compose. So the first run, I'm setting the compose to 1. Now this is outputting that value, which is 1. Moving on, going to 2. So I'm setting it to 2. And then my output is also 2. So keep going, 3. And then the output is 3. So on the right, if we use a compose instead of variable, it's what we can expect, and everything is all good. And we kind of bypass that limitation, right? So this is, another pro tip I posted a while ago, but a lot of times I like using composes instead of variables. You don't have to initialize them. It's just like an easier way. Now, sometimes you still need variables. They're still come in handy. But for reasons like this, a lot of times a compose can be better. And then as a bonus, this is what I would not expect at all. But basically, after this loop is done, we're going to output the value of this compose. And I didn't even think you would be able to reference it because this compose only exists inside this loop, which typically means it wouldn't exist outside of it, but we can still actually use it. The interesting thing is if we look at this, it's actually an array of everything that it's putting in here. So that can come in handy as well. It's something I wouldn't expect at all, but it's cool to know about. So as it's like putting values in this compose, it's like essentially appending it into an array. So when we reference it here, it's an array, which is kind of interesting because when we reference it inside the loop, it's only giving us that one exact number, but outside it's an array. So pretty cool. Um, and a lot of this stuff is not documented, right? So you're kind of just playing around with it to figure it out. So that quick pro tip ended up being a little bit longer, but hopefully it was helpful, and hopefully you learned something new today. Thank you for watching.